Patrolman I.J. Helms was walking on Taylor Street, near its intersection with 3rd Avenue, shortly before 6 a.m., when he began to hear the sound of broken glass. Responding, he quickly turned the corner onto 3rd Avenue, between Taylor and Yamhill Streets, to discover a horrible sight. The New Ross Hotel, on the west side of 3rd, was engulfed in flames. As Helms ran to the scene, he saw 2 women perched on their second-floor window ledges, one of whom was the landlady, Ida Morris. Helen had barely managed to throw a robe on, while Ida was fully dressed. The women said they were going to jump, out of desperation, but right then, Helms heard the sounds of the siren from the fire department. They would be there in seconds, and Helms begged the women to wait till the firefighters arrived, which they did. Ida was helped down a ladder to safety, where she watched her hotel burn. And I wonder what she was thinking in that moment. The New Ross Hotel was originally 2 matching, 3-story frame houses dating back to the 1880s that were connected in the middle to make one hotel. Something like this was begging to become a fire trap, with some rooms requiring one to go through a second room before reaching the hallway. There were 6 men staying at this hotel the night of January 19th into the morning of the 20th, all of whom will be referenced in this film. And then there were the 2 women, Ida Morris and her chambermaid, Helen Flint. So here's Southwest 3rd Avenue, between Yamhill at that intersection down there, and then Taylor Street right here. And historically, this is actually a very interesting block, particularly on that side of the street. In terms of dark history, right at the corner here was the home of Emma Merlotten, who was murdered. She was a French courtesan, pretty much a high-priced sex worker. And she lived in a little home right over here, and she was attacked and murdered in her home in 1885, a murder that's still unsolved to this day. And right here, practically right next door, would have been the house that a woman named Carrie Bradley ran, and she had all kinds of vice going on outside of her place. This was also the 1880s, and there was a guy by the name of, I believe, John Brown, who her cronies kind of lured here, and then they murdered him and dumped his body in a trunk, and they tried to do a bunch of stuff. It was a very oddball story, but that was kind of in her famous early Portland murder. And then you move pretty much one place over, right, pretty much in line with pretty much probably between this elevator and the stairwell. This is where 2 tall 3-story frame houses once were, and at one point they were combined right in the middle and changed into a hotel that was called the New Ross Hotel. And that is where this tragedy occurred. Again, shortly before 6 a.m. is the time when the fire broke out. Morris and Flint managed to wait on their ledge to be saved by firefighters and their ladders. Tenant Boo Davis was also there with the 2 women. He had been rousted out of a sleep by Helen banging on his door, and he managed to escape down the ladder with her. 2 other tenants on the second floor, Frank Talbert and Charles Ellers, who shared a room, also managed to escape. Talbert seriously wounded his hand, punching a window out, and the 2 were able to leap from there, naked mind you, through an opening into the neighboring Taylor Hotel, right as their personnel were closing their fire doors. Once there, they begged for some clothing, as they were nude and it was January. Unfortunately, there were 3 other men staying at that hotel who were not able to escape. In the aftermath of the fire being extinguished, the body of Ernest Marquardt, a logging engineer, was found in the hallway on the 2nd floor, only feet from the window that would have led him onto the fire escape. The body of Taylor Washburn, a rancher from Eugene looking to settle in Kelso, Washington, was found in a closet, also next to a window that would have led him onto a fire escape. And finally, the body of logger Thomas Logan was found in his room, located next to Ida Morris's, laying on the floor at the base of the window that led out onto a fire escape. All 3 men were so close, it appeared, to safety. But unlike the other 2, who appeared to have been trapped in the hallway, Logan's room was hardly damaged, and yet he never escaped. Putting the pieces of Ida Morris's story together, it appears she was awakened by the fire, claiming flames were already creeping into her room. She said she quickly rushed out of the room and knocked on Taylor Washburn's door before forcing it open. She said he came running out, seemingly in a panic, and instead of going for a window to escape, he shot straight into the dense smoke, which must have consumed him. Ida returned to her room, where she then heard loud banging at her door, which she inferred to be Ernest Marquardt, trying to alert her as to the fire and attempting to, quote, save her. She then climbed out of her window onto the ledge, while Helen Flint did the same from her window. And right up here would have been roughly 2nd floor view. A lot of the action in this fire actually happened on the 2nd floor, so this kind of would have been their view down to the ground. Yeah, a lot of people that were kind of trapped had to escape from windows on the 2nd floor. This would have been about their perspective. Marquardt was ultimately found dead down the hall from Ida's room. Despite her claims here, we cannot know for certain that it was Marquardt who banged on her door. It may have been Washburn, still frantically running around. To complicate matters further on this issue, after making these statements, Ida Morris was quoted to say, "Ernest must have come downstairs after I left." Some newspapers would say that Morris's room was in the middle of the 2nd floor, but this would have allowed her to easily escape onto the fire escape. My guess is Thomas Logan was actually in the middle, as his room was next to hers and he did have easy access to the fire escape. Helen Flint was also on the 2nd floor. She would suggest having a clairvoyant experience wherein she was asleep, dreaming of being trapped in a large room surrounded by flames, only to wake up to this fire already in progress. Maybe this happened, but I also know people loved making up crazy stories like this back in these days, especially if they could get it in the local papers. The fire's origin was traced to a storeroom adjoined with the hotel's kitchen. This was also located on the 2nd floor and right across from Ida's room. The fire rapidly spread upwards towards the 3rd floor at that point. While the local fire marshal, J.W. Stevens, and a small group of assisting officers investigated the cause of the fire, an investigation that lasted weeks, he was quick to hold the owner of the building responsible. With all 3 of the deceased a short distance from fire escapes, Stevens noted that he'd told the building's owner, L.A. Ackerman, more than a month earlier that the building had multiple code violations, namely that necessary lights indicating the locations of fire escapes had not yet been installed. Oddly enough, only days after he was first warned about these violations, on New Year's Eve 1916, L.A. Ackerman dropped dead, leaving the fire marshal to focus the pressure on Ackerman's agent, Mark Schlussel. Schlussel claimed the heirs to this property were away on the East Coast, and he'd been unable to contact them about dealing with these violations. Simply put, Stevens kept his focus on Schlussel, holding him responsible for dealing with the situation, and Schlussel maintained his stance that it was the heirs' responsibility whenever they came back to the West Coast. And thus, nothing happened. Stevens noted that, with his level of authority, he could not legally force these places to follow regulations. All he could do was tell them what to do, over and over again. Despite Ida stating she had installed signs marking where fire escapes were, the conclusion was still reached early that these men died because they could not reach the escapes quickly enough. While granted it was the early morning and the rooms and hallways were probably dark, making lights a much more effective item in this case, this conclusion still does not explain why Thomas Logan appeared to just lay down and die in front of the window to his escape, or why, of all things, Taylor Washburn ran into a closet and just stayed there during the blaze. For the first couple weeks after the fire, Schlussel and these unnamed heirs were the bad guys, and the fire at the New Ross was used as another example as to the tragedies that could occur when such a place was not following proper fire codes. This was bolstered by a coroner's jury, who also determined the owners were responsible. But that attitude was soon to change. It's important to note that the coroner's jury reached this conclusion while Fire Marshal Stevens testified that he was still investigating the origins of the fire. And after that long investigation into the cause, Stevens and his, what was called Arson Squad, reached the conclusion that the fire was, in fact, an arson. Without ever going into details as to why they felt the fire was intentionally set, this was the conclusion reached by these professionals. While the owners of the building were still negligent in this case, they could not be held responsible for a fire that was intentionally set by somebody else. Stevens was quoted to say that going after the owners was pointless at this time and that, quote, slight fines would be imposed and that would be the end of it, while vastly more important consequences may result from the investigation now underway. He'd obviously uncovered something pretty serious. By this time, which was late April 1917, a great deal had been learned about Ida Morris, the landlady. She had lived in Portland for many years, previously running a hotel on Southwest 1st Avenue, simply known as the Ross Hotel. She made headlines in December 1913 for personally apprehending a panty-stealing thief, dragging him by the collar down to the first floor and holding him there till the police arrived. She was tough, no one to be messed with. She also had some suspicious connections. Bootleggers, for instance. In March 1916, only weeks into Oregon's implementation of Prohibition, the Ross was raided, and Ida was found to be storing some 500 quarts of beer in that hotel, and some 1,000 empty bottles were found on the property as well. In municipal court, after being sentenced to 60 days in jail, she fainted and had to be rushed to the hospital. After her release, her 60-day sentence was conveniently suspended. I doubt this was her only mix-up with illegal booze. According to one newspaper, she had taken over at the new Ross Hotel only 2 months before the fire, and by this time she was struggling financially. She had reportedly relocated to the Oregon coast town of Astoria shortly after the fire, but now she was wanted on a murder charge for intentionally setting the fire that destroyed the new Ross and killed 3 men. And the motive? Money. In addition to having financial struggles, Ida had insured the $400 worth of furniture at the hotel for the excessive amount of $1,800. She thus must have burned the hotel down so she could collect that insurance money, and her financial problems would have been solved. Bumbling law enforcement somehow leaked the indictment against her to the press before it was even officially served, making for serious embarrassment to the district attorney's office. But beyond that, this leak gave Ida, if she was on the run, foreknowledge of her planned arrest and extra time to escape. Whatever her plans were and whatever she knew, Ida was abruptly apprehended, hiding out on a small boat along the Columbia River, just across the way from the small Oregon town of Rainier. A trunk full of her goods were found on the boat as well, which may not sound all that strange, without the knowledge that she had shipped these prized possessions to her relatives, who owned the boat, only days before the fire happened. As she was ushered back to Portland, Ida pled her innocence, but was still indicted on a second-degree murder charge, as well as a charge of arson. Her trial was set for late June, but come June 24th, it was announced that her trial would be delayed until a current murder case was concluded. And then, less than 24 hours later, the charges were abruptly dismissed due to a lack of evidence. This by no means suggests that nobody felt that Ida Morris was actually responsible for the fire, but rather there was a concern as to whether, based on the evidence available, she would be found guilty at trial. And if she were acquitted once, she could not be tried again. After being in jail since the end of April, Ida Morris was released, never to be arrested on the matter again. Odds are, by this time, all the evidence that could be known on the matter was known, and therefore there were no further bombshells strong enough to indict Ida again. She was able to live out the rest of her life. The last reference I found on her noted she was living in Northwest Portland. In that reference, it noted a friend up in Portland visiting her had died suddenly. I hate to see this as suspicious, and it was probably just a coincidence, but a story like that pricks my ears up, 'cause I think Ida Morris burned her hotel down. Why was Ida Morris the only person out of everybody who was fully dressed? Everybody else was either naked, partially naked, or had to throw on a robe real quick. She was perfectly clothed, which infers at least the idea. Did she know this was going to happen in advance? And she was pre-prepared. This was January. It was cold outside. She didn't want to be stuck outside freezing cold. So she had her clothes on. Now, her explanation, which seems strange and unlikely to me, but granted, this was 1917, maybe this was more of a normal thing back then, I don't know, but this seems odd to me. Ida Morris's explanation for why she was fully dressed when she was evacuated was that she frequently had to wake up in the middle of the night to check on people in their rooms. That was her explanation. Now, it still seems to me you would at least change back into your bedtime attire. I don't know. The whole explanation in general, on the face of it, seems odd to me, that she was just constantly checking rooms in the middle of the night. I had to check the rooms at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. That doesn't make sense to me. Constantly waking up your not patrons, but people that are staying there in the middle of the night, constantly waking them up to check on them, that seems bizarre to me. That seems illogical to me. Now, maybe that was a 1917 thing, but I think she probably had her clothes on because she knew this fire was going to happen, and she was pre-prepared. Ida Morris just happened to be staying in a room near the middle front of the second floor. And it was learned that the origin of the fire was in a closet in the kitchen area, which was also on the second floor, literally feet from Ida Morris's room. So if Ida Morris was personally responsible for the fire, which I feel honestly is the most likely scenario in this case overall, she could have gone from her room. You know, it's the 5 o'clock hour, everyone's asleep, no one's going to hear her. She could have gotten to that room, started a fire, got back to her room in seconds without anybody seeing or hearing her. Strongest possible motive. Ida Morris was in dire financial straits in the days and weeks leading up to when this fire happened. She was in such a dire situation that she offered to sell Helen Flint, her chambermaid. She offered to sell her a whole bunch of her furniture for $500, which on the face of it sounds insane. This is 1917, mind you. We're talking $1917 here. And this woman who runs this hotel has this chambermaid who probably makes barely any money, lives there with her, and she tries to coax this chambermaid into giving her $500 for this random furniture. Something tells me Helen Flint had probably never had $500 in her whole life. But it appears Ida Morris was desperate. She had said furniture insured. Again, furniture altogether was only worth a few $100s, up to like $500. She had it insured for up to $1,800, which is just a ridiculous level of insurance. But if anything happened to destroy, conveniently, that furniture, she stood to collect up to $1,800, which in 1917 was more than $42,000 in today's money. That's a lot of cash. That's definitely enough to get you out of a financial bind. So there's an absolute motive there with the fact that she insured things for so much. And I think in these dying, desperate days leading up to her ultimate decision to set the fire, this desperate act to try to get herself out of this financial situation, she tried something else. She tried to get Helen Flint to buy this furniture. Maybe that $500 would have gotten her out of her situation. And when that didn't work, as it obviously didn't, she finally decided, I have no alternative but to burn this place down and collect the insurance money. And in the literal days leading up to when the fire happened, days, Ida Morris does two, in my opinion, suspicious things. One of them outwardly suspicious, another suspicious to me, at least when you think about it. The first thing she does is she packs up a bunch of her belongings into a trunk, sends it off to some relatives for safekeeping. Very convenient. She got these items that were probably of the most importance to her in her life out of the building, and then days later it's destroyed. So that's very suspicious, and it's just another piece of circumstantial evidence that shows that probably days in advance Ida Morris was thinking, like she was putting the plan in motion that this was going to happen, and she wanted to get all her ducks in a row. Now, another thing that she does only days before the fire happens is, now this is by her own account, which I'll get to my suspicions about this in a moment. She stated that days before the fire happened, she placed signs on the wall indicating where the fire escapes were, which you'd think would compensate for one of the primary things that the fire marshal deemed was the cause of these men's deaths, which was they couldn't get to the fire escapes because there wasn't proper lighting there for it. But you'd think that would have been compensated for by these signs that Ida Morris said she put up. Now, on the face of it, you could look at that and say, like, oh, well, I mean, look, this woman put up signs to show people where the fire escapes were. This was a sweet old landlady. She was looking out for her people. And that's one way to look at it. However, if you look at it another way, I think she knew. I mean, what are the odds? You put these signs up saying, hey, if you need to, fire randomly happens, you need to get out on the fire escape, here's how you get there. And then suddenly a few days later, an actual fire happens. I think Ida Morris, she had criminal connections. She had connections to bootleggers back in the day. This was not a sweetheart by any means. But I think her primary motive was money. She didn't want anybody to die in this fire. And I think she put those signs up in preparation because she didn't want anybody to actually die. That's the inference that I make by the fact that she put these signs up and then suddenly, boom, the place goes up in smoke. Now, that's if you believe Ida Morris' story about putting these signs up. I found no verification provided by anybody. The search of the building in the aftermath, I found no verification from anybody else that she had actually put these signs up, including the survivors of the fire, who you'd think would have seen the signs while visiting there. Now, of course, these signs could have been obliterated by the fire. But I seriously question whether these signs were actually put up, and it may have just been Ida Morris spewing lies to make it look like she was doing her best to protect this hotel of hers. Especially now that a fire's already happened, she wants to play damage control whether she's guilty of setting the fire or not. But again, here's the issue. The primary reason given for why these men perished in the fire is because they didn't know how to get to the fire escape and they didn't get there in time. And then, of course, there's the whole they didn't have the proper lights in there. Well, if these signs were actually put up on the walls indicating where the fire escape was, then why do these men still not seem to know where the fire escape was? I have very serious doubt that Ida ever put these signs up, and I think she just said she did to protect her image as a landlady doing what she could to run a place and, the poor victim survivor of this horrible fire. And while I think about the idea that Ida clearly had these connections with people from the crime world, a particular witness in relation to the fire, I don't know the circumstances. It never said specifically. I don't know if it was not somebody staying at the hotel. There was a witness by the name of Mrs. Frank Morrison, who, she was just that. She was a witness. And from what I've gathered, there weren't really a lot of witnesses. It's the early morning hours, and, pretty much everybody who was inside the hotel were trying to escape. So there probably weren't a lot of outsiders like Mrs. Morrison here that could perhaps, regardless of what she saw, maybe shine a light on something that wasn't known. Shortly after the fire, Mrs. Morrison started getting harassed by strange men she did not know. One of them approached her while she was just walking down the street in downtown. And, they were... This seems to me like this is a very these are criminal types, is where they don't even tell you exactly, if you were a witness to a murder, they aren't going to say, hey, that murder you say you saw, you never saw that murder. But they make a point of being very vague, but still saying something in a way that, what they're talking about. Mrs. Morrison claimed this guy that she encountered in downtown confronted her and literally just told her, hey, what you're doing right now, lay off. And only a day or two later, in the middle of the night, a random man, another man she didn't know, came to Mrs. Morrison's house. Knocked on the door, she answered it, and this guy essentially said that they would take care of her if she kept on with what she was doing. So again, this very vague phraseology if that's the right word for it. But it is very interesting that a woman who's a witness to a fire that at that time was presumably just an accident, why is this one witness being harassed? What is the point of that? And what are the odds that these guys harassing her were harassing her for something else? Extremely unlikely. So it makes me wonder, who did Ida Morris have at her disposal to mess with or intimidate people that might point a finger at her? It really makes me wonder what Mrs. Morrison may or may have not seen. Unfortunately, that information is never really talked about. The only thing they wanted to talk about in the newspapers was the fact that this woman was being harassed. And this is something that's always suspicious, no matter who you are. When you do this, it makes you look suspicious. Ida Morris had lived in Portland for a good many years. She'd been running, a couple hotels, well, the Ross and then the New Ross, for at least 4 or 5 years. And she'd been in the Portland area for a really long time. And then conveniently after the fire happens, and a lot of the blame is put on the owners, but there's still this ongoing investigation to try to figure out, this intensive investigation to figure out, how did this fire happen? She would still have a motive to kind of slowly, kind of slip out of town. And that's exactly what she did. Shortly after the fire, she left the Portland area for the first time in years. She was traced to Astoria, and she was finally found, presumably hiding on this little scow, this little boat, along the Columbia River, across the river from Rainier. So if you start going up the river from Portland, Rainier is up there in the Oregon Peninsula. Now here's the part that's really bewildering to me. And this is based on quotes from Ida Morris. This isn't hearsay. This is based on what she was quoted to say. So it's her story, her take on what happened. Now, she said early on that when she was, she'd just been woken up by the fire, she was trying to escape, she claimed that somebody started banging on her door. And she presumed, we don't know if it was, she presumed this was Ernest Marquardt coming to her door, banging, probably trying to let her know that a fire was taking place. And so, fortunately, she was able to escape out of her room. And she says, "Oh, he came to my door and banged on my door to see if I was okay. He tried to save me." Now, we have no proof that Ernest Marquardt was the guy banging at the door. We have no evidence that this event even happened. And what's so strange to me, and this is really odd, is that all 3 men who died, there are very strange circumstances regarding supposedly how their final moments were. And in the case of Ernest Marquardt, he was on the 3rd floor. So as the fire began, he managed to get down to the 2nd floor without seeing the fire escape. He's on the 2nd floor, doesn't find the fire escape, and then apparently goes up to Ida Morris's room and starts banging on the door. Now, if that was actually him banging on the door, I highly doubt he was trying to save Ida Morris. I think he was trying to save himself. I highly doubt. During this time, people didn't lock their doors. A lot of people didn't lock the front doors to their home. I very highly doubt the door to Ida Morris's room was locked. And even if it was, this guy should have been able to break the door down. I'm just wondering why he just banged on the door and then just stayed out there and perished in the smoke. It seems to me he would have opened the door. If it was locked, he would have tried to break it down. Of course, escaping through Ida Morris's room would have left you on a ledge. It wouldn't have been the same as getting onto the fire escape. Maybe at that point the fire had blocked access to the fire escape. Because again, the fire was set in the kitchen really close to where Ida Morris's room was. So I'm wondering, if it was Ernest Marquardt, why didn't he break into the room? If he was banging on the door so much, why didn't Ida Morris open the door for him? If he was such a great hero trying to save her, why did she just listen to him banging on the door out there in all that smoke? And then she just said, "Oh, thank you," and then just went to the window and climbed out and just left him there. And that's just one guy. And here's where things really don't make sense. is because Ida Morris tells that story. So it's implied she wakes up, she becomes aware there's a fire, Marquardt bangs on the door, and she escapes out the window onto the ledge. But she then adds to her story. And see, this is where I get suspicious of people's personal accounts, is when, you can just tell that they're not being honest, because one, their stories are they just seem ridiculous. But beyond that, they don't line up well. Because then we have Taylor Washburn, who I believe was staying on the second floor. Ida Morris claims that she wakes up, and at the point she wakes up, the fire is already creeping into her room. Her room is already on fire. So what does she do? She doesn't get out of bed and climb out the window. She gets out of bed and runs out of her room and goes specifically to Taylor Washburn's room. There were 6 people staying there, but conveniently she only went to check on one person, which happened to be another one of the guys that died. And she claims that she goes up, she bangs on the door, he doesn't answer, she has to force the door open, and then he just runs out. And just like a chaotic animal, he darts out of his room, and instead of going with her to her room to escape, or going to the window to the fire escape, which is right there, he just runs off chaotically into the smoke and fire. And he ends up dying. And what's so bizarre is he was discovered in a closet that was right next to a window that he could have escaped out of. So his behavior is, if you believe Ida Morris's story, which unfortunately we don't really have anything else to go on, this guy sounds like he just had a complete mental break and he was just running around chaotically, and instead of seizing multiple options to escape the building, he ran, and it looks like he hid in a closet right next to where the flames were, and literally within a couple of feet of a window that would have led him out onto the fire escape. You have Ernest Marquardt and Taylor Washburn. It's almost like they weren't really trying to escape, or they just didn't, the way it's described is like they just had mental breaks, and I think a lot of that is because all we have to go on is Ida Morris's telling of events. And I don't really think I believe much, if not any of it. But I think, again, it makes Ida Morris look like both a hero and a victim. She went and tried to save Taylor Washburn. She braved the flames to save one of her tenants. She's a hero. And then moments later, Ernest Marquardt comes to her door and tries to save her. Now she's the victim who needs to be saved. And oh, thank God she managed to escape to safety. And then there's the third guy who dies, whose name is Thomas Logan. I don't know how to make sense of Thomas Logan. And even newspapers noted how strange his death was. And it almost makes me consider another possible theory in this crime. One that I have no evidence to back, but one that would actually suggest Ida Morris wasn't responsible. It is just a theory, but I want to make it known because there's a lot of mystery behind this whole story. Now, I don't know a lot about Thomas Logan, but according to the description of how he died, he reportedly was on the second floor in a room right next to Ida Morris. Yet Ida Morris made no mention of going to his door and knocking on his to try to get him out. And you're like, oh, well, maybe the area where his room was too overcome by smoke and flames and she couldn't get to it. Well, I don't think so, because Thomas Logan was found dead in his room, less than a foot from the window that would have led him onto the fire escape. He was right there. And it looks like he was just found dead right in front of the window, like he just laid down and gave up. So you think, okay, well, maybe the guy was overcome by smoke inhalation. Well, a bunch of these other people were able to at least run around. 2 guys were able to escape out of a window. Shouldn't this guy have been able to escape? And then it's later noted there was practically no damage to his room. It appeared no flames had gotten in there before the fire was extinguished. It didn't even look like much smoke had gotten in there. It was noted that even the wallpaper on the walls hadn't been,
messed up or even frayed a little bit by the heat from the fire. Thomas Logan probably had the safest room to be in if you had to stay in a room in that building when it was on fire. And yet, he just like laid down, it seems, in front of the fire exit and made no effort to save himself, even though it seems like he was in a set of circumstances that he absolutely could have done that. So it makes me wonder, he's on the second floor. Again, this is just a wild theory that popped into my head. He's on the second floor. He's right next to Ida Morris, which means he is also right next to the kitchen where the fire started. And I'm wondering, did this guy screw up? Much like Ida Morris, Thomas Logan could have gotten from his room to the kitchen and back in seconds. And perhaps he could have set that fire, setting it at a spot right next to his room, and then he just stayed in his room and waited to die for whatever reason. A wild theory, I'll admit. I just find it strange that it seems like he had more of an opportunity than anybody else to escape his room, and it looks like he made no effort to do so. Why? And of course, there's some holes with that theory. You'd think, like, if he wanted to die so bad, why would he do it in a way that put everybody else's lives in danger? Everybody in the city had a gun. Why wouldn't he have just gotten a gun and taken care of himself that way? Why would he set fire in a room next to his room? Why wouldn't he just, if he's gonna set a fire, set it in his own room and get it over with? So there's absolute holes with that theory. I don't know how to make sense of his death. And based on what we know about the three victims, I don't know what sense to make of any of their final moments. They all have these really strange, bizarre circumstances surrounding their final seconds, and they all ended up dead in that hotel. Now, before I completely run away with what I think actually happened, it is important to stop and take a moment to breathe and look at the possible counter arguments to what you're saying. Granted, I feel like most of them have a possible explanation to them, but there are a few possible elements of this whole case that may suggest that Ida Morris wasn't responsible. First and foremost, considering the time, there were no witnesses. Nobody saw her set this fire. Nobody saw anybody set this fire. So objectively, it is still unknown who set it. Obviously, Ida Morris or anyone else in the world would have a reason to set a fire, at a time like that in the middle of the night when presumably everybody is asleep. Nobody's going to hear you tiptoe from your room to the side of the fire and tiptoe back. So it makes sense to set the fire at that time. Another important aspect is, if you are the responsible party setting the fire, you'd think you would see to it that you would be safe. Again, I don't think Ida Morris set this fire with the intent on killing anybody, but when you set a building you're in on fire, you are perceivably putting yourself in danger. And it is important to note that if Ida Morris did set this fire, she was just about as endangered as anybody else. We can't validate any aspects of her story before she is climbing out onto that window ledge and people outside actually see her, because that's all based around her observations and the potential observations of two men that died in the fire that cannot tell their side. So if Ida Morris set this fire with the intent of, say, collecting insurance, she didn't do a really good job of making sure that she got away safe. The fact that she was in her room and that she had to climb out onto the ledge and kind of hang off this ledge on the second floor, and reportedly was yelling along with Helen Flint, like, we're gonna jump, and then waited just long enough for the firefighters to show up. It shows that her life was in danger. So you'd think if she was to set the fire, you'd think she would set it, maybe not right next to her room, or you'd think, she'd set the fire and then go downstairs real quickly. This could potentially be chalked up. I don't know a whole lot about Ida Morris's background other than, a few elements here or there. But I don't think she was a very seasoned arsonist. So some of this could be chalked up to her just not being very experienced about this. She could have set a fire and thought, okay, it's going to take a while to burn and spread, and the fire spread much quicker than she thought it was going to. And all of a sudden, in a matter of moments, suddenly it's filling the hallway on the floor she's on with smoke, and all of a sudden she's trapped in her room and has to make this rapid decision to escape out her window, because at that point that was her only option. The fire, as I understand it, had gotten to the vicinity of the staircase down to the first floor, so she couldn't sneak out, try to cup her mouth and go downstairs. So it is interesting, but again, some of these elements could be chalked up to the likelihood that Ida Morris did this out of desperation and probably didn't know exactly how the fire was going to spread, and more importantly, how rapidly the fire was going to spread. And I do keep coming back to this major booze bust that happened at the prior hotel she ran only a year earlier. And at the time, we were a few months into Prohibition. That was the largest booze bust made in the city of Portland, was the one that was made in the original Ross Hotel that Ida Morris was the proprietor of. You don't end up like that without having a connection to some criminal elements, namely, bootleggers and rum runners and those types of people. It makes me wonder, how far reaching were those connections? And is it possible Ida Morris could have been still technically responsible for the fire, in that she got some thugs or whomever that she knew to come and set this fire for her, do her a favor so she could score this money. And she leaves the downstairs open to easily access the second floor. Some guys sneak in on her behalf, and they set the fire in this storeroom, which probably had a lot of random items in it. Maybe it was kind of a pantry since it was by the kitchen, possibly a lot of flammable stuff. They set the fire and they took off into the night. And in that vein, while still bearing responsibility, Ida Morris wouldn't know how quickly that fire was going to spread. Having no part in actually setting the fire, that could be another possible explanation as to why she didn't get out quicker than she did. She maybe thought she was going to have more time than she actually did. But I also consider the opposite of this, the notion that this fire may have been set on Ida Morris's behalf by some criminal types that she may have known. I look at the fact again that Ida Morris was struggling financially and was in desperate need of money. Now, there's no explanation exactly what the situation is, if it was just that she was broke. I mean, she was running a hotel. She did have money coming in at some level. But there's no explanation as to exactly what her major financial issues were, just that they were there, and she was clearly very desperate to get them taken care of, even to the point of, again, offering her chambermaid all of this furniture for $500, as though a chambermaid in 1917 would just have that money on them. And the reason I mention this is because I wonder if maybe some of Ida Morris's financial issues, now again, this is just another theory, but it suggests that she actually wasn't guilty. Technically, her actions led to it, but she was not responsible for the fire. Could these financial problems have had something to do with money she owed some of these, members of the world of crime in Portland that was just everywhere back then? And if you in particular owe people like this money, sometimes they will take drastic measures. Sometimes they will come and kill you. Is it possible that to send a message to Ida, who probably needed this money and couldn't get it and therefore couldn't pay off some debts she had, some guys showed up and set pretty much the most important thing in her life, one of the only things that was probably actually bringing in money for her, which was this hotel she ran. They showed up, set fire, and destroyed that thing as an element of revenge. That's entirely possible. It would totally sync with the actions of some criminals, high-up criminals, underworld type figures. Sometimes they don't kill you, but sometimes they hit you where it hurts the most. So is it possible that someone snuck in and set that fire? Now, I guess on the flip side, you think she owes them money. Why would they kill one of her only revenue streams? But sometimes getting that revenge is more important than anything else. So that's just another theory. I feel like it's pretty long odds that it's actually what happened. It's just something else that I thought was worth mentioning and pondering. So there's not a whole lot that I feel really argues definitively that Ida Morris couldn't have been responsible for this fire. There's just a few little things that I wanted to make sure to mention. And it is important. I do want to mention this. In addition to the fire marshal and his little group, there were a few others that came in and investigated the site of the fire and the origin. And it was mentioned in a newspaper that there were numerous different conclusions reached by people involved, which suggests some thought it wasn't an arson fire. But the fire marshal, who arguably would have the best credentials to make or to reach a conclusion on something like this, said he was absolutely 100% sure this fire was set intentionally. It just leaves a little bit of room for doubt. Like, did the fire marshal get perhaps a little overzealous in his conclusions? I personally can't say for sure, but it's another question worth pondering, another area that may create some doubt in some people's minds. Yeah, I'd say in a scenario where you're asked a question and you absolutely have no choice but to answer, scale of 1 to 10, how certain do you feel in your own mind that Ida Morris was responsible for this fire that took the lives of 3 men? I want to say 8. 8 out of 10. I'm almost leaning towards a 7. There's just the slightest bit of doubt, but I still think she did it.